At its peak, Westinghouse Electric was inside more American homes than any other company on Earth. Not as a guest, but as furniture. The refrigerator in the kitchen, the washing machine in the basement, the television in the living room, the light bulb overhead, all of them carrying the same circular logo with a single letter. W. In 1979, Westinghouse reported nearly $9 billion in revenue and employed over 140,000 people across 40 countries. Children grew up in homes their parents furnished with Westinghouse appliances. Those parents had grown up the same way. The brand did not just sell products, it sold the idea that American engineering was permanent, that something built in Pittsburgh would still be working when your grandchildren were born. By 1997, the company had renamed itself CBS Corporation. The name Westinghouse, 111 years old, was quietly sold to a licensing group. Today it appears on budget televisions at Walmart and ceiling fans at Home Depot, manufactured by companies with no connection to the original. The logo is the same. Everything behind it is gone. How does the company that defeated Thomas Edison, that lit the Chicago World's Fair, that powered the first nuclear submarine, how does that company end up selling its own name? At Show 23, there's G6. George Westinghouse was not the kind of man who worked in a laboratory. He was not a theorist. He did not wear a white coat or fill chalkboards with equations. He was a machinist, a man who understood problems the way a carpenter understands wood, by touching them, turning them over, finding where they gave way. He was born in 1846 in Central Bridge, New York, the son of a farm equipment manufacturer. He grew up around machines the way other boys grew up around fields. By the time he was 22, he had already invented the railway air brake, a device that allowed trains to stop simultaneously across all their cars instead of relying on individual brakemen turning hand wheels in the dark. The railroad industry adopted it almost immediately. It saved thousands of lives. And it made George Westinghouse, at an age when most men were still finding their footing, into someone the industrial world took seriously. But the air brake was only the beginning. What Westinghouse wanted, what he spent the rest of his life chasing, was something larger. He wanted to solve the problem of electricity itself. In the early 1880s, electricity in America was a novelty that only the wealthy and the industrial could access. Thomas Edison had built a direct current system, DC, that could power lights and motors within a small radius of a generating station. If you lived or worked within about a mile of one of Edison's stations, you could have electric light. If you lived outside that radius, you burned gas or kerosene like everyone else. Edison's system was brilliant. It was also fundamentally limited. Direct current could not travel far without losing power. The physics would not cooperate. Westinghouse understood this. He had read the work of European engineers who were experimenting with alternating current, AC, a different form of electricity that could be stepped up to high voltages for long-distance transmission and then stepped back down for safe use in homes and factories. The math was clear. AC could go where DC could not. An alternating current system could reach not just the wealthy blocks near a city generating station, but every farm, every small town, every house at the end of a dirt road in Ohio or Tennessee. In 1885, Westinghouse imported a transformer system developed by a team of engineers in Europe and began testing it in his own home in Pittsburgh. The following year, he founded Westinghouse Electric Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was 39 years old. Then he did something that would change the course of American technological history. He read about a young Serbian-born inventor named Nikola Tesla who had developed a complete alternating current motor system. Not just the transmission, but the generation and use of AC power as a unified whole. Westinghouse traveled to New York, met Tesla, and in 1888 purchased the rights to Tesla's AC patents for $200,000 plus royalties. It was one of the most consequential business transactions in American history, though almost nobody recognized it as such at the time. What followed was not a quiet period of development. It was a war. Thomas Edison understood exactly what Westinghouse and Tesla were building, and he understood what it meant for his own system. Edison launched what historians now call the War of Currents, a public campaign to convince America that alternating current was lethally dangerous. He funded demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted with AC power in front of journalists. He lobbied state governments. He worked to associate Westinghouse's name with death. When New York State adopted the electric chair as a method of execution in 1890, Edison quietly ensured it ran on AC current, hoping the association would destroy public confidence in the technology. Westinghouse did not respond in kind. He did not run newspaper campaigns or stage demonstrations. He responded the way he always responded, with engineering. He kept building. He kept refining. He kept proving, one installation at a time, that AC power was not only safe but transformative. The moment that settled the argument came in 1893. The organizers of the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, put the electrical contract out for bid. Edison's General Electric bid $1 million to light the fairgrounds. Westinghouse bid $399,000. He got the contract. On the evening of May the 1st, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a button inside the fairgrounds main hall. 100,000 incandescent lights running on Westinghouse AC power came on simultaneously across 200 acres of grounds on the shore of Lake Michigan. The crowd went silent. Then they began to applaud. Journalists who were there wrote that they had never seen anything like it, that the buildings seemed to glow from within, that the lagoons reflected the light like mirrors, that the whole spectacle felt less like a fairground and more like a vision of the future. Thomas Edison had lost, not in a courtroom, not in a newspaper, but in the most public place in America, in front of millions of witnesses. Westinghouse had not just won a contract, he had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable argument, that alternating current was the future of electrical power in the United States. Within a decade, AC systems were spreading across the country. The grid that powers the United States today, the one that runs through every outlet in every home, runs on the principles that George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla proved in Chicago in 1893. He had not only built a company, he had changed the physical infrastructure of American life. But in 1907, during a financial panic that swept through American markets, Westinghouse Electric faced a liquidity crisis. The company's board, the same men who had benefited from everything George Westinghouse built, forced him to step down. He fought it. He lost. He spent the last years of his life largely removed from the company that bore his name, working on smaller inventions in a smaller workshop, watching from a distance as other men ran what he had created. He died in New York City on March 12, 1914. He was 67 years old. His company was 28 years old. It had another 85 years left. Years of extraordinary achievement, years of slow erosion, and finally an ending that George Westinghouse never could have imagined. 23 Worcestershire 6. There is a particular kind of morning that millions of Americans over the age of 50 can still reconstruct from memory without trying very hard. It begins in a kitchen. The floor is linoleum. The countertops are either white or pale yellow. There is a percolator on the stove, and the smell of coffee has already moved through the house. And standing against the wall, broad and white and humming just barely loud enough to notice, is a refrigerator with a round chrome handle and a small circular emblem near the top of the door. The letter W inside a ring, Westinghouse. This was the American kitchen of the 1950s and 1960s, and Westinghouse was its defining presence. Not because the company had the best advertising, though the advertising was memorable. Not because the products were the cheapest, because they were not. But because Westinghouse had spent decades earning something that cannot be bought outright. The specific trust that comes from a product working year after year without asking anything from the person who owns it. The post-war period was the great age of American appliance ownership. Soldiers came home from Europe and the Pacific, married, moved into houses they had never lived in before, and began filling those houses with things their parents had not owned. Refrigerators replaced ice boxes. Automatic washing machines replaced washboards and wringers. Televisions appeared in living rooms where there had only been radios. This was not just economic activity, it was a transformation in what daily life felt like. in how much time a household spent on basic survival tasks and how much time it had left over for everything else. Westinghouse was positioned at the center of this transformation in a way that no single competitor could match. The company did not just make one type of appliance. It made the refrigerator and the washing machine, and the electric range, and the dishwasher, and the room air conditioner, and the television, and the light bulbs and the fixtures, above all of it. A family in suburban Columbus or Sacramento or Charlotte could, without making any particular effort, furnish an entire household with Westinghouse products. Many of them did. The refrigerators are where the memory lives most clearly for people of that generation. In 1958, Westinghouse introduced one of the first widely available frost-free refrigerators in America, a model that eliminated the periodic ritual of defrosting, the one domestic chore that required actual physical labor and planning, the draining of water and the chipping of ice, and the temporary loss of refrigeration while the coils thawed. For the housewife who had been managing that process every few weeks for years, the frost-free refrigerator was not a luxury. It was a restoration of time. Reviewers in consumer publications of the period described it in almost reverential terms. Families who bought one told their neighbors about it, the way people today describe software that changed how they work. The washing machines carried their own particular weight in American domestic life. Before automatic washers became widespread, laundry day was exactly that, a day. A full day of sorting, soaking, agitating by hand or with a wringer machine, rinsing, wringing again, hanging, and waiting. Westinghouse's automatic washers, which became increasingly reliable and affordable through the 1950s, compressed that day into a set of machine cycles that required attention only at the beginning and the end. Women who had spent their Mondays consumed by laundry now had Mondays back. This is not a small thing. In oral histories collected from women of that generation, the automatic washer appears again and again as the single domestic technology that changed their lives most concretely. The television division brought Westinghouse into American living rooms in a different register, not as a workhorse appliance, but as the center of family entertainment. Westinghouse TV sets of the late 1950s and 1960s were known for picture quality and cabinet craftsmanship. These were not pieces of electronics to be hidden in a corner. They were furniture, placed in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs arranged to face them, the new hearth around which the family gathered in the evenings. When color television arrived in the mid-1960s, Westinghouse was among the early manufacturers producing color sets for the consumer market. And the transition from black and white to color, the first time a viewer saw a football field in green or a variety show in full light, is a memory that people of that era describe with a vividness that suggests it landed as a genuine sensory event. The light bulbs were everywhere. This seems almost too ordinary to mention, but it is exactly the ordinariness that made Westinghouse so embedded in American life. A family might replace a refrigerator once every 15 years. They replaced light bulbs constantly, and the brand on the box became habitual in the way that habitual purchases become invisible. Westinghouse bulbs were in homes, in offices, in schools, in hospitals. The name was in front of Americans with a frequency that no advertising campaign could replicate, because it was not advertising, it was infrastructure. The slogan of the period captured the brand's position with unusual accuracy. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse. It ran in print advertisements, on television, in radio spots. It was spoken by Betty Furness, a television actress who became the company's spokesperson in the 1950s and who delivered the line with a calm authority that matched the brand's identity perfectly. Not exciting, not flashy, but certain. Certain in the way that a properly built thing is certain, you can be sure. The American consumer of 1958, standing in an appliance showroom trying to decide between 3 refrigerators of similar price, heard that line and felt something specific. Not excitement, confidence. What was it about that logo, that simple W inside a circle, that made a generation of Americans feel like the decision was already made for them? In 1964, Westinghouse built a pavilion at the New York World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, Queens. The theme was the home of the future. Visitors walked through rooms demonstrating push-button appliances, automated cooking systems, and a vision of domestic life in which technology had removed almost all of the friction from daily existence. Lines stretched outside the pavilion for hours. People waited in the summer heat to walk through a demonstration kitchen and watch a Westinghouse dishwasher cycle through its program. This was the height of something, not just of a company's influence, but of a particular American conviction that engineering and optimism were the same project, that the future was a place being built right now by people who knew what they were doing, and that the letter W on a white enamel door was evidence that the project was in good hands. By the late 1960s, Westinghouse employed more than 100,000 Americans. Its factories ran in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, Indiana, and across a dozen other states. The engineers at its research facilities held patents in nuclear energy, defense electronics, power generation, and consumer technology. The company was not merely large, it was woven into the physical and economic structure of mid-century America in a way that made it seem, to most observers, like a permanent institution, like something that would simply always be there. It would not always be there. But in the spring of 1965, standing in the Westinghouse Pavilion at the World's Fair, watching the lights come on in a kitchen that did not yet exist, that ending was completely invisible. What was visible was the future, bright, humming, and marked with a W. 23 TSG6. The decision that would eventually unmake Westinghouse was not made in a moment of crisis. It was made in a moment of confidence. That is the detail that makes it tragic rather than simply unfortunate. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Westinghouse was not a company in trouble. It was a company that believed, with considerable evidence to support the belief, that it could do anything. The logic was not unreasonable. Westinghouse had spent 80 years demonstrating an ability to move from one technological frontier to the next. It had gone from railway air brakes to electrical generation, to consumer appliances, to broadcasting, to defense electronics. Each expansion had worked. Each new territory had been entered with engineering competence and had produced results. The company's leadership looked at this track record and drew what seemed like the obvious conclusion: that Westinghouse was not simply an appliance manufacturer or an electronics company, but a diversified industrial conglomerate capable of competing in any technically complex field it chose to enter. The field they chose in the late 1950s and through the 1960s was nuclear energy. And for a time, the choice looked like genius. The connection was not arbitrary. Westinghouse had a genuine claim to nuclear technology that predated the commercial power industry entirely. In 1954, the company won a contract with the United States Navy to design and build the reactor for the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. The Nautilus launched in 1954 and demonstrated, in one of the more dramatic technical achievements of the Cold War era, that nuclear propulsion was not a theoretical possibility, but an engineering reality. Westinghouse had built it. The Navy trusted Westinghouse with the work because Westinghouse had the engineering culture to do it right. The same culture that had designed turbines and generators and industrial electrical systems for half a century. From the Nautilus, Westinghouse moved into civilian nuclear power. The company developed the pressurized water reactor, a design that became the dominant nuclear power plant model in the United States and eventually in much of the world. Westinghouse built reactors for commercial power plants across the country through the 1960s and 1970s. Utilities signed contracts. The federal government promoted nuclear energy as the answer to American power needs. The future, it appeared, belonged to the atom, and Westinghouse intended to own that future. At the same time, the company was expanding its footprint in broadcasting. This thread ran back to the earliest days of radio. Westinghouse had operated KDKA in Pittsburgh since 1920, widely credited as the first commercial radio station in the United States, the station that broadcast the results of the 1920 presidential election and demonstrated for the first time that radio could be a medium for mass public communication. By the 1950s, Westinghouse owned a group of television and radio stations in major American markets: Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, Fort Worth. These were not peripheral holdings. They were profitable, influential, and increasingly central to the company's identity in ways that would have significant consequences later. The consumer appliance business, meanwhile, was doing what it had always done: generating steady revenue and maintaining the brand's presence in American homes. But inside the company, the appliance division was beginning to occupy a different position in the hierarchy of strategic importance. Nuclear energy was the growth story. Broadcasting was the prestige story. Appliances were the legacy business, reliable, familiar, and gradually receiving less of the investment and management attention that a competitive consumer market requires. This shift was subtle in the early years. Product development continued. New models came out on regular cycles. The factories kept running, but the engineering talent and capital that might have gone into refrigerator compressor technology or washing machine motor design was increasingly being redirected toward reactor engineering and broadcast infrastructure. The appliance division was being asked to sustain itself on its reputation, while the company's ambitions moved elsewhere. The franchise model that Westinghouse used for some of its appliance distribution added another layer of complexity. Independent dealers who had built businesses around the Westinghouse name began to notice, in the late 1960s, that the product updates were coming less frequently, that the engineering differentiation that had justified the brand's premium positioning was narrowing. A Westinghouse refrigerator in 1968 was still a good refrigerator, but the gap between a good Westinghouse refrigerator and a good General Electric refrigerator was smaller than it had been in 1958, and the gap between either of them and the increasingly capable Japanese appliances beginning to enter the American market was closing faster than the company's leadership appeared to recognize. The expansion into financial services began quietly and with an internal logic that seemed sound at the time. Westinghouse Credit Corporation was established to provide financing to customers purchasing Westinghouse appliances and industrial equipment. The basic model was straightforward: a manufacturer offering its own credit terms to make large purchases more accessible. General Electric had done something similar with GE Capital. Ford had Ford Motor Credit. The pattern was established and defensible. What happened next was a function of the era. The 1970s and 1980s were a period of financial deregulation and expanding credit markets. Westinghouse Credit Corporation, having established itself as a functioning financial entity, began to move beyond its original mandate. It began lending to commercial real estate projects, office buildings, shopping centers, developments that had no connection to the sale of Westinghouse appliances or equipment. The returns looked attractive. The risk models of the period said they were manageable. The division grew. Nobody at the senior level of the company appears to have asked the obvious question with sufficient force. What exactly does a company that makes refrigerators and nuclear reactors know about commercial real estate lending? The question had an answer, and the answer was, not very much. But in the expansion climate of the 1980s, that answer was not the one that got heard in boardrooms. By the mid-1980s, Westinghouse was a company that manufactured consumer appliances, built nuclear power plants, operated television stations, provided industrial electrical equipment, and ran a commercial real estate lending operation. It was by any measure a remarkable collection of businesses. What it was not anymore was a company with a coherent identity, a central idea about what it existed to do and who it existed to serve. The employees in the Pittsburgh factory still knew what they were doing and why it mattered. The engineers in the nuclear division still understood their mission with precision. The television station staff understood broadcasting. But the connective tissue, the shared sense of purpose that had once made Westinghouse feel like a unified enterprise rather than a holding company, was thinning. The W on the logo was the same. The company behind it was becoming something else. The peak was still ahead, but the weight that would bring it down was already being accumulated, one decision at a time, in offices far removed from the factory floors and kitchen showrooms where the Westinghouse name had actually been built. 23 through 6. In 1979, Westinghouse Electric Corporation reported revenues of approximately $8.8 billion. It employed 147,000 people. It operated in 40 countries. It built the reactors that generated a significant portion of American commercial nuclear power. It owned television stations in 5 of the largest media markets in the United States, and in the kitchen of nearly every home where someone over the age of 30 had grown up, there was at least one object that carried the circular W. That number 147,000 employees, is worth pausing on because it represents something beyond a workforce headcount. Each of those people had a family. Each of those families lived in a community built partly around the economic gravity of a Westinghouse facility. Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Leicester, Pennsylvania, Bloomington, Indiana, Sturtevant, Wisconsin. These were not abstract dots on a corporate map. They were neighborhoods where people owned homes because Westinghouse paid reliably, where the local diner stayed open because the shift change brought customers at 6 in the morning, where the high school booster club could count on the plant manager showing up to the fundraiser. Westinghouse was not just a company in these places, it was a civic institution. The television stations added a different dimension to the brand's reach, one that operated not through the kitchen or the laundry room, but through the living room screen. Westinghouse Broadcasting, known internally and in industry circles as Group W, operated major network affiliates in Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, and Fort Worth. Group W was not a passive broadcast operator, it was an innovator. In 1967, Group W stations began airing a local talk format that would become the template for decades of American daytime television. A format built on audience participation, topical conversation, and a host who moved through the crowd rather than sitting behind a desk. The Westinghouse stations were where Mike Douglas built his audience, where Merv Griffin refined his craft before going national. The connection between Westinghouse and American living room culture ran deeper than most viewers ever knew because it ran through the programming they watched, not just the set they watched it on. There was a particular kind of cultural saturation that Westinghouse achieved in this period that is difficult to fully convey to anyone who did not live inside it. The brand was not loud. It did not pursue the kind of aggressive, personality-driven marketing that some of its competitors favored. Its advertising was calm, competent, and consistent. The Betty Furness spots of the 1950s had established a tone of quiet authority that the company maintained through the following decades. You can be sure if it's Westinghouse. The line worked not because it made an exciting claim, but because it made a credible one. In a consumer landscape full of promises, Westinghouse promised only reliability, and then delivered it year after year until reliability became the brand's entire identity. The generational transmission of that trust is something that comes through clearly in the oral histories and forum conversations of people who grew up in Westinghouse households. A woman who is 60 years old today can tell you that her grandmother had a Westinghouse refrigerator that ran for 22 years without a service call, that her mother bought a Westinghouse washer when she got married in 1965 and used it until 1981, that when she herself set up her first apartment in 1983, buying a Westinghouse appliance felt less like a consumer decision and more like a family tradition, a continuation of something that had been working for as long as she could remember. This is what brand equity looks like at its deepest level. Not recognition, not preference, inheritance. How many American brands can honestly say that 3 generations of the same family chose them not because of advertising, not because of price, but because the product had never given them a reason to look elsewhere? The cultural moment that best captures Westinghouse at its apex is not an advertisement or a product launch. It is the 1964 New York World's Fair Pavilion, which drew visitors by the hundreds of thousands and presented Westinghouse's vision of domestic life in the year 2000. Visitors walked through rooms where appliances responded to voice commands, where cooking was automated, where the home had become a place of leisure rather than labor. It was aspirational in the most optimistic sense, a company saying, in public, that it believed the future was going to be better than the present, and that it intended to build the technology that would make it so. The crowds who waited in line to walk through that pavilion were not just curious about gadgets. They were participating in a shared American belief that progress was real, that it was ongoing, and that it was being made by companies like this one in cities like Pittsburgh, by engineers who came to work every morning and solved problems that had not been solved before. The employees at the height of this period described their experience of working for Westinghouse with a consistency that is striking across interviews and accounts from different facilities in different decades. The word that comes up most often is not salary or benefits, though both were competitive. The word is pride. Pride in the product, pride in the name. A machinist at the East Pittsburgh plant who spent 30 years building turbine components for power generation equipment did not think of himself primarily as a worker who assembled metal parts. He thought of himself as someone whose work was running inside power plants across the country, keeping the lights on. That sense of connection between individual labor and national infrastructure was something Westinghouse's identity made possible. It was not manufactured by a human resources department. It grew from the actual scale and consequence of what the company built. And then, in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the revenue and the workforce and the civic presence and the brand trust that had accumulated across 3 generations, something happened that almost nobody outside a specific set of boardrooms and legal offices understood at the time. In 1975, Westinghouse Electric Corporation notified 27 electric utility companies that it would not be honoring its uranium supply contracts. The company had agreed in the early 1970s to deliver uranium at a fixed price of roughly $8 per pound to utilities that had purchased Westinghouse nuclear reactors. The contracts were designed to make the reactors more attractive. Buy the plant, and we will supply the fuel at a guaranteed price. It was a reasonable commercial offer in 1971 when uranium was cheap and nuclear energy appeared to be an industry with a stable cost structure. By 1975, the price of uranium on the open market had risen to roughly $40 per pound. Westinghouse did not have the uranium it had promised. It did not have the money to buy it at current prices. It cited force majeure, an act of circumstances beyond the company's control, and walked away from approximately $2 billion in contractual obligations. 27 utilities filed suit almost immediately. The litigation would consume enormous legal and financial resources for years. But more than the legal exposure, the uranium crisis revealed something structural about how Westinghouse had been managing its nuclear business, with an optimism about future costs and supply conditions that had no adequate margin for error. The company had made promises it could not keep at a scale that could not be quietly resolved. The customers in their kitchens did not know any of this. The families who were buying Westinghouse appliances in 1975 and 1976 had no reason to know. The W on the refrigerator door looked exactly the same as it always had. The warranty card was the same. The product worked the same. But behind the logo, in the financial structure of the corporation, a fault line had opened, and the pressure building along it was not going to stay invisible for much longer. Taramli 23, here through 6. The uranium crisis of 1975 did not announce itself to the American public as a crisis. It arrived in the business press as a legal dispute, 27 utilities, contractual obligations, force majeure declarations, the language of corporate litigation that most people outside the financial industry neither followed nor found reason to follow. The families buying Westinghouse refrigerators in 1976 were not reading the Wall Street Journal coverage of the uranium lawsuits. They were not connecting the dots between a nuclear fuel contract dispute and the appliance brand they had trusted for 20 years. There were no dots visible to connect. The store shelves looked the same. The products worked. The warranty was still there. But inside the company, the consequences were immediate and structural. Legal defense costs for multi-party litigation at that scale ran into the tens of millions of dollars annually. Settlement negotiations with 27 separate plaintiffs, each with their own legal teams and their own financial exposure, consumed executive bandwidth at the highest levels of the organization for years. The final settlements, reached through the late 1970s after prolonged negotiation, cost Westinghouse an estimated $800 million when totaled across all parties, a figure that had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the operating budget of a company that had been stretched across nuclear, broadcasting, defense, appliances, and now financial services simultaneously. The first place the cuts landed was research and development for consumer products. This is almost always how it works in a diversified industrial company under financial pressure. The division that generates steady, predictable revenue but does not represent the future as the leadership imagines it becomes the source of funds for the divisions that do. Westinghouse's consumer appliance business had been the company's most reliable revenue generator for 3 decades. It was also, by the mid-1970s, the division that the company's strategic leadership had mentally classified as mature. A business to be managed rather than grown, maintained rather than reinvented. The reduction in R&D investment did not produce an immediate collapse in product quality. That is not how engineering decline works. A refrigerator compressor designed in 1968 could still be manufactured reliably in 1975. The machinery was in place, the processes were documented, the workers knew the work. What the reduction in investment meant was that the next generation of compressor technology, the next improvement in energy efficiency, the next innovation in storage design, was not being developed at Westinghouse with the same urgency or resources that it was being developed at General Electric, or at the Japanese manufacturers who were studying the American appliance market with close and serious attention. Whirlpool had been building its engineering capabilities quietly and consistently through the 1970s. General Electric was investing heavily in appliance technology, and from Japan, brands that most American consumers had not yet encountered in the appliance category were beginning to demonstrate what focused, well-funded engineering could produce in refrigerators, air conditioners, and washing machines. The competitive landscape was shifting in ways that required a response, a real response with capital behind it, not a managed decline dressed up in marketing language about brand heritage and customer loyalty. In 1974, Westinghouse made a decision that, in retrospect, announced the direction of everything that followed. The company sold its consumer appliance division, the refrigerators, the washing machines, the ranges, the dishwashers, to White Consolidated Industries. The sale was framed internally and publicly as a strategic rationalization, a focus on higher-margin businesses where Westinghouse had proprietary technology in stronger competitive position. The logic was defensible on a spreadsheet. Nuclear reactors and defense electronics carried better margins than washing machines. Broadcasting generated revenue without manufacturing overhead. The appliance business required capital investment to remain competitive, and the company had decided at the highest levels that it did not want to make that investment. What the spreadsheet did not capture, what spreadsheets rarely capture, was what the appliance business meant to the brand. The W on the refrigerator door was not just a product marking. It was the most consistent and intimate point of contact between Westinghouse and the American consumer. It was the reason a 60-year-old woman in 1974 still felt something specific when she heard the name Westinghouse. Not a corporate entity, not a conglomerate, but the refrigerator her mother had owned, the washing machine that had changed her Mondays, the television her family had gathered around. That connection could not be transferred to White Consolidated Industries. It stayed with Westinghouse, the name, the trust, the inherited loyalty, while the products that had built it passed to another owner. For several years after the sale, White Consolidated continued manufacturing appliances under the Westinghouse brand name under a licensing agreement. The products still said Westinghouse. The logo was the same. A consumer buying a Westinghouse refrigerator in 1977 had no particular reason to know that the company that made it was not the same company that had made her mother's refrigerator. This arrangement provided Westinghouse with licensing revenue without manufacturing responsibility, which was precisely the kind of financial engineering that looked attractive in the short term and hollowing in the long term. How long could a brand sustain itself on a name that was no longer connected to the engineering culture that had made the name mean something? The television business was undergoing its own quiet transformation in the same period. The rise of cable television in the late 1970s began eroding the audience dominance of network affiliates. Group W stations, which had been among the most profitable broadcasting properties in the country through the 1960s and early 1970s, faced a structural shift in how Americans consumed television that no amount of local programming excellence could fully offset. The business remained profitable, but the trajectory was changing. In the consumer electronics sector, televisions, radios, audio equipment, the competitive pressure from Japanese manufacturers was not quiet or gradual. It was fast and comprehensive. Sony introduced the Trinitron color television tube in 1968, a technology that produced a demonstrably superior picture to anything then available from American manufacturers. Panasonic and Toshiba were building distribution networks across the United States and pricing their products at levels that American manufacturers, with their higher labor costs and older manufacturing infrastructure, struggled to match. Westinghouse's television manufacturing operation, which had been a point of pride through the 1960s, was caught between the quality leadership of the Japanese brands at the top of the market and the aggressive pricing of lower-cost manufacturers below. In 1974, the same year it sold its appliance division, Westinghouse sold its television and consumer electronics manufacturing operations as well. The company exited the consumer hardware business almost entirely in a single year. Appliances in one transaction, televisions and electronics in another. Two of the three pillars of the brand's presence in American homes gone within months of each other. The third pillar, the light bulbs, would follow within a decade. What remained of Westinghouse's consumer identity after 1974 was essentially a name, a logo, and a licensing arrangement. The company was still enormous. It still built nuclear reactors and operated television stations and manufactured industrial equipment for power generation and defense. By most financial measures, it was still a healthy corporation. But the Westinghouse that millions of Americans carried in their memory, the company whose products they had grown up with, trusted and passed on to their children, had been quietly, efficiently, and almost completely dismantled, not by a competitor, not by a market collapse, but by the company's own strategic choices. The families who had been loyal to the brand for 3 decades did not receive a letter. There was no announcement in the newspapers. The stores still carried products with the Westinghouse name. Everything looked, on the surface, exactly as it always had. That was the most disorienting part, the collapse of something real proceeding in plain sight, while the appearance of continuity was carefully maintained. 23-6, the man who inherited the consequences of Westinghouse's strategic overreach was not the man who had created them. Douglas Danforth became chief executive of Westinghouse in 1983, stepping into a company that was still large, still profitable in several of its divisions, and still carrying the weight of decisions made through the previous decade that had not yet fully revealed their cost. Danforth understood that the company needed focus. He accelerated the divestiture of businesses that did not fit what he envisioned as Westinghouse's future. A leaner, more technology-intensive enterprise built around nuclear energy, defense electronics, and broadcasting. The consumer businesses were mostly gone. The financial services division, Westinghouse Credit Corporation, was growing. And somewhere in the logic of the era, growing felt like the right direction. The 1980s were a decade in which financial engineering was not just accepted in American corporate culture, but celebrated. Companies that moved money around cleverly were rewarded by Wall Street with higher valuations than companies that simply made things well. The leveraged buyout era was remaking entire industries. Conglomerates were being assembled and disassembled at a pace that made the patient, incremental growth model that George Westinghouse had practiced seem almost quaint by comparison. Westinghouse Credit Corporation fit neatly into this environment. It had started as a financing arm for appliance and equipment purchases. By the mid-1980s, under the expansionary logic of the period, it had evolved into something significantly larger and more complex. A commercial lending operation with a growing portfolio of real estate loans that had nothing to do with selling refrigerators or building nuclear reactors. The commercial real estate market of the mid-1980s looked, to the financial models of the time, like a reliable place to deploy capital. Office buildings were being constructed across American cities. Shopping centers were expanding. Developers needed financing. Westinghouse Credit Corporation provided it at terms competitive with regional banks and thrifts that were themselves expanding aggressively into commercial lending under the deregulated environment created by the Garn-Saint-Germain Act of 1982. The returns were attractive. The risk, as modeled, appeared manageable. Nobody in the boardroom appears to have pressed with sufficient persistence the question of what expertise Westinghouse actually possessed in evaluating commercial real estate credit risk. What knowledge the company had developed through decades of building turbines and designing reactors and manufacturing washing machines that would allow it to assess whether a shopping center in suburban Phoenix or an office park in Atlanta was a sound lending proposition. The answer, had anyone pressed it, was that Westinghouse possessed almost no such expertise. It was a manufacturing and engineering company operating a bank. The distinction mattered enormously when the market turned. The real estate correction that began in the late 1980s and accelerated through 1990 and 1991 was not a sudden crash in most markets. It was a slow, grinding decline in commercial property values that left developers unable to service their debt and lenders holding collateral worth less than the loans it secured. Westinghouse Credit Corporation had accumulated a commercial real estate portfolio that, when the correction arrived, revealed itself to be significantly impaired. Loans that had been classified as performing stopped performing. Properties that had been valued as adequate collateral were revalued downward, then downward again. The write-offs began. In 1992, Westinghouse Electric Corporation announced a write-down of approximately $975 million related to bad loans in its credit division. It was one of the largest single-year write-downs in American corporate history at that point. The stock price, which had already been under pressure, fell further. Credit ratings were downgraded. The company that had once seemed as permanent and reliable as the electrical grid it had helped build was now a subject of anxiety on Wall Street and confusion among the public that still associated the name with the refrigerator in its parents' kitchen. The human cost inside the company was immediate. Layoffs across multiple divisions followed the write-down. The corporate offices in Pittsburgh reduced headcount. Plants that had already been operating at reduced capacity faced further cuts. For workers who had spent their careers at Westinghouse, machinists, engineers, administrative staff who had joined in the 1960s and expected to retire with the company, the announcements of 1992 were a rupture. Not because they were surprised that large companies could struggle, but because this was Westinghouse. This was the company that had powered Niagara Falls and built the reactor for the USS Nautilus and put a television set in their parents' living room. The sense of institutional permanence that the brand had always projected, and that many of its own employees had genuinely internalized, made the collapse feel not just economically damaging, but personally disorienting. Who exactly was supposed to be protecting what these people had built over 30 years? The new chief executive who arrived to manage the aftermath was Paul Lego, who had been inside the company for decades and understood its engineering culture. Lego implemented cost cuts, accelerated asset sales, and attempted to stabilize the financial picture. He did not succeed quickly enough for the board. In 1993, the directors replaced him with Michael Jordan, not the basketball player, but a former executive from PepsiCo and CBS, who brought with him a perspective on the company's future that was fundamentally different from anything in Westinghouse's history. Jordan looked at Westinghouse and saw a company with strong broadcasting assets, the Group W television stations, embedded inside a struggling industrial conglomerate. His diagnosis was that the industrial identity was the problem, not the solution. The manufacturing businesses, the nuclear division, the defense electronics operations, these were, in Jordan's framing, legacy weight that was dragging down the value of the broadcasting assets. The path forward, as he articulated it to the board and to investors, was to transform Westinghouse from an industrial company into a media company. The manufacturing would be sold, the debt would be reduced, the broadcasting business would be grown through acquisition until it was large enough to stand on its own as a major American media corporation. The board accepted this vision. Wall Street found it compelling. And in 1995, Michael Jordan executed the transaction that formalized the transformation. Westinghouse Electric Corporation agreed to acquire CBS Inc. for $5.4 billion, creating a combined entity that would operate under the Westinghouse name, but would function, in every meaningful sense, as a broadcasting company that happened to still own some industrial assets it was in the process of selling. The acquisition of CBS was announced as a triumph. Westinghouse was buying one of the three major American television networks. It was entering the top tier of the media industry at a moment when media consolidation appeared to be the defining business trend of the decade. Analysts wrote approvingly about the strategic logic. The stock moved positively on the announcement. But inside the company, inside the facilities that had been building things since 1886, the announcement of the CBS acquisition landed differently. Engineers who had spent careers designing reactor components understood, with a clarity that did not require a business school education, what it meant when an engineering company spent $5.4 billion. It did not readily have to buy a television network. It meant the engineering was over. It meant the identity that had been built across a century of making things that worked, things that powered cities and propelled submarines and kept food cold in a million American kitchens, was being exchanged for something else. Something that had nothing to do with Pittsburgh, nothing to do with the W. In 1996, Westinghouse sold its power generation business, the turbines and generators that traced their lineage directly to the work George Westinghouse had done in the 1880s, to Siemens of Germany. In 1997, it sold the nuclear power plant business, the division that had built reactors for the Navy and for commercial utilities across the country, to British Nuclear Fuels Limited for $1.1 billion. The buyer retained the name Westinghouse Electric Company for the nuclear operations, a name now attached to a business owned by a British government corporation operating in a narrow industrial segment with no connection to the consumer brand that millions of Americans remembered. The divestitures were complete. The transformation was done. What had been assembled over 111 years, the appliance business, the electronics business, the light bulb business, the turbine business, the nuclear business, the defense electronics business, had been systematically sold piece by piece until nothing remained except the broadcasting assets and a corporate shell that still, for a little while longer, carried the name of a man from Pittsburgh who had once defeated Thomas Edison in a contest to light the world. 23 G. 6. The end did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a series of administrative decisions, each one logical in isolation, each one a further step away from anything George Westinghouse would have recognized as his company. By the time the final act was completed, there was no dramatic moment to point to, no bankruptcy filing, no factory fire, no product recall that made front pages across the country. There was only a press release, a board vote, and a name change. The oldest and in many ways the most consequential industrial brand in American history ended not with a collapse but with a rebranding. The CBS acquisition had closed in November 1995, and from the moment it did, the practical reality of what Westinghouse had become was visible to anyone paying attention. The headquarters of the combined company remained nominally in Pittsburgh, but the center of gravity had shifted entirely to New York, where CBS operated its network and where the broadcasting industry lived. The Westinghouse executives who traveled to the CBS offices found a culture that was alien to everything they had known, a world of ratings and affiliate negotiations and entertainment programming and advertising sales that operated on entirely different rhythms and priorities than turbine manufacturing or reactor engineering. The CBS journalists and producers, for their part, looked at their new corporate parent with a mixture of confusion and unease. They had been bought by a company that made industrial equipment. The fit was not obvious to anyone on either side of the transaction. Michael Jordan moved aggressively to complete the industrial divestiture program. The power generation business went to Siemens in 1996. The defense electronics operations were sold or wound down. The nuclear division went to British Nuclear Fuels in 1997. With each sale, the company became more purely a broadcasting operation and less the industrial conglomerate that the name Westinghouse had signified for over a century. The proceeds from the divestitures went toward reducing the debt that had accumulated through the credit corporation losses and the CBS acquisition financing. The balance sheet was improving. The identity was dissolving. In December 1997, Michael Jordan stood before Westinghouse's board of directors and made the recommendation that completed the transformation. The company, he argued, should rename itself. The Westinghouse name was associated in the public mind with manufacturing, with industrial products, with a business identity that no longer matched what the company actually was. The company was a broadcaster now. It owned CBS. It should say so. The board agreed. On December 1, 1997, Westinghouse Electric Corporation officially changed its name to CBS Corporation. The announcement was covered in the business press as a routine corporate rebranding, a logical culmination of a strategic transformation that had been underway for years. The financial analysts who covered the company treated it as housekeeping, a formality that brought the legal name in line with the operational reality. In the context of the 1990s media consolidation wave, it was not even a particularly surprising move. Companies changed their names all the time as their businesses evolved. What the business press did not write about, because it was not the kind of story that fit neatly into a financial analysis, was what the name change meant to the people for whom the name Westinghouse had been something other than a corporate identifier. The retired machinist in East Pittsburgh, who had spent 30 years making turbine components and considered his Westinghouse employment the defining professional fact of his life. The woman in her 60s who had grown up in a house where every major appliance carried the W and had always associated that letter with reliability and with her mother's kitchen. The engineer who had worked on reactor designs through the 1970s and carried a quiet pride in having contributed to the power infrastructure of the country. For these people, the name change was not housekeeping. It was the formal announcement of a death that had been occurring gradually for 2 decades. There was no ceremony. There was no acknowledgement in the announcement of what was being set aside. The press release from CBS Corporation on December 1st, 1997, did not mention George Westinghouse. It did not mention the Chicago World's Fair, or the USS Nautilus, or the frost-free refrigerator, or the 30 million American homes that had once contained a product with that logo. It mentioned the company's broadcasting assets and its strategic positioning in the media landscape and its commitment to shareholder value. It was written in the language of corporate communications, which is a language designed to move forward without looking back. The physical transition happened with the quiet efficiency of corporate administration. The signs came down from buildings in Pittsburgh. The letterhead changed. The email domains changed. Employees who had carried business cards reading Westinghouse Electric Corporation received new ones reading CBS Corporation. In the offices, someone had arranged for the old Westinghouse materials to be collected and disposed of. Not preserved, not archived with any particular ceremony, just cleared away to make room for the new identity. On the factory floors that remained, fewer now than there had been, and getting fewer, the workers who had built things under the Westinghouse name continued to do their jobs. Some of those facilities would be sold with their respective divisions. Some would close. The specific communities where Westinghouse had been the dominant employer, East Pittsburgh most notably, where the company had operated major manufacturing facilities since the late 19th century, would not recover quickly from the cumulative effect of the divestiture and downsizing that had been ongoing since the mid-1980s. East Pittsburgh today is a small borough of about 2,000 people. At the height of Westinghouse's manufacturing presence there, the company employed more people in that single location than the entire current population of the borough. The consumer brand, the name and logo, that had been licensed to White Consolidated Industries after the appliance sale, and that had continued to appear on products in American stores through the 1980s and into the 1990s, was now a piece of intellectual property to be managed separately from the corporation that had created it. The Westinghouse name for consumer products passed through a series of licensing arrangements that placed it on progressively less distinguished merchandise. Televisions sold at mass-market retailers, ceiling fans, small kitchen appliances, LED light bulbs in blister packaging at hardware stores. The W logo appeared on all of them, unchanged in its visual form, carrying in its design the authority of a century of engineering excellence and delivering, behind that design, products that had no connection to that excellence whatsoever. A consumer in 2005 who bought a Westinghouse television at a discount retailer because the name felt trustworthy, because somewhere in their memory the W meant something solid and American and reliable, was buying a product made by a contract manufacturer in Asia under license from a holding company that had purchased the brand rights from CBS Corporation, which had renamed itself from a company that had sold its consumer electronics business in 1974. The chain of custody between the name and the thing the name had once guaranteed had been completely severed. The trust was being spent on products it had not earned. What do you call a name that survives the death of everything that made it mean something? What is a brand, in the end, when the engineering and the factories and the people and the mission are all gone and only the logo remains? The CBS Corporation that emerged from the Westinghouse transformation was itself not a permanent institution. In 1999, Mel Karmazin's CBS was acquired by Viacom for $37 billion. The company that Westinghouse had spent $5.4 billion to purchase just 4 years earlier was now absorbed into a larger media conglomerate. The Westinghouse strategic transformation, sell the engineering, buy the broadcaster, become a media company, had produced in the end not a durable new identity, but a transaction, one more step in the consolidation of American media that had nothing to do with Pittsburgh, nothing to do with alternating current, nothing to do with the kitchen where someone's grandmother had kept her food cold in a Westinghouse refrigerator for 22 years without a single service call. The W remained. Everything it had once stood for was gone. My UT3 G. A 6. The building at 401 Penn Avenue in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Westinghouse Electric had operated its main transformer and switchgear manufacturing complex for nearly a century, sat largely vacant through much of the 2000s. It did not burn down. It did not collapse dramatically. It simply sat there, a long, low structure of brick and steel and glass, its parking lots emptying and its loading docks going quiet, while the borough around it contracted. Businesses that had served the plant workers, the diners, the hardware stores, the small shops that exist in the commercial ecosystem of a large employer, reduced their hours, reduced their staff, and in many cases closed. The tax base of the borough shrank. The school district lost enrollment. The houses nearest the plant, which had once been occupied by workers who could walk to their shift, went on the market at prices that reflected the new economic reality of a place that had lost its reason for being. This is what the end of Westinghouse looked like at ground level. Not a headline, not a bankruptcy filing covered on the evening news. Just a borough getting smaller and a building getting quieter. And a generation of workers trying to figure out what came next in their 50s and early 60s, at an age when starting over is not the adventure it might have been at 25. The workers who had built their lives around Westinghouse employment were not, for the most part, left without recourse. The pension obligations were largely honored, though the process of disentangling retirement benefits through multiple corporate transactions and divestitures was complex enough that some workers spent years in uncertainty about what exactly they were owed and by whom. The benefits that had been earned were, in most cases, eventually delivered. But the community infrastructure that those workers had built and sustained over decades, the neighborhoods, the institutions, the social fabric of a place organized around a shared employer, did not survive the departure of the economic engine that had created it. Pension checks arrived in mailboxes in houses on streets where the drugstore had closed and the hardware store was gone, and the diner where you talked to people who did the same work you did had been empty for 3 years. The nuclear operations that British Nuclear Fuels acquired in 1997 under the Westinghouse Electric Company name continued to operate and eventually passed to Toshiba in 2006 for approximately $5.4 billion. The same number, in a coincidence that carries its own kind of irony, that Westinghouse had paid for CBS in 1995. The Westinghouse Electric Company of today, owned since 2018 by Brookfield Business Partners after Toshiba's nuclear ambitions produced their own financial catastrophe, is a genuine and significant enterprise. One of the world's leading providers of nuclear reactor technology and services, with thousands of employees and a substantial engineering legacy. It operates under the Westinghouse name. It has no meaningful connection to the consumer brand that millions of Americans remember, and it makes no particular effort to maintain one. It is a B2B industrial company that happens to share a name with the refrigerator in somebody's grandmother's kitchen. The consumer brand followed a different trajectory. After passing through CBS Corporation and several subsequent licensing arrangements, the Westinghouse name for consumer electronics and appliances was acquired by a series of holding companies whose primary business was brand licensing. Organizations that maintained trademark registrations and negotiated manufacturing agreements with contract producers, primarily in Asia, who would apply the name to finished goods for sale in American mass market retail channels. The products that carry the Westinghouse name today, the budget televisions at Walmart, the LED bulbs at Home Depot, the ceiling fans and small kitchen appliances at discount retailers, are manufactured to the specifications and price points of the retail channel, not to any engineering standard derived from the original company. They are not bad products, necessarily. Some of them are adequate, but they are not Westinghouse products in any sense that George Westinghouse or the engineers and workers who built the company would recognize. The companies that filled the space Westinghouse vacated in the American consumer market did so without ceremony. Whirlpool absorbed the white consolidated appliance operations that had been making Westinghouse branded refrigerators and washing machines, and grew into the dominant American appliance manufacturer. General Electric maintained and eventually sold its appliance division to Haier of China in 2016. Samsung and LG, the South Korean manufacturers that had been building their American market presence through the 1980s and 1990s, became the aspirational brands for a new generation of appliance buyers who had no particular memory of or attachment to the American brands of the post-war era. The market did not mourn the absence of Westinghouse. Markets do not mourn. They fill the available space with whatever is next. The broadcasting assets that Westinghouse had purchased CBS to acquire became, after the Viacom acquisition, part of the complex of properties that eventually formed Paramount Global. The television stations, the network, the programming library, all of it absorbed into a larger structure that has itself undergone multiple transformations since. The strategic logic that Michael Jordan presented to the Westinghouse board in 1993, sell the manufacturing, become a media company, produced an outcome that lasted approximately 4 years before the media company itself was sold. The transformation destroyed one of America's oldest industrial institutions and created a transaction, not a legacy. The broader lesson that Westinghouse's collapse offers to American industrial history is not a simple one, and it resists the kind of clean moral framing that makes for satisfying business school case studies. It is not simply a story of greed. Though there was greed, it is not simply a story of strategic incompetence, though there were incompetent strategic decisions. It is a story about what happens when a company loses faith in the thing it actually knows how to do, when the culture of making things, of solving engineering problems, of building products that work and last, is displaced by the culture of managing financial assets and optimizing for quarterly returns. Westinghouse did not fail because it was attacked by a superior competitor. It failed because it dismantled itself voluntarily in pursuit of a different kind of company that it never had the DNA to become. What does America lose when a company like this disappears? Not just the products, not just the jobs, but the institutional knowledge, the engineering culture, the accumulated understanding of how to build things that work and make them last? The answer is not abstract. It is East Pittsburgh with its vacant lots. It is the retired machinist who built turbine components for 30 years and watches budget televisions bearing his old company's logo sold at Walmart for $149. It is the engineering tradition, the specific, practiced, generationally transmitted knowledge of how to design a reliable compressor or a durable washing machine or a reactor that runs safely for 40 years. That does not survive the liquidation of the organization that developed and sustained it. When that knowledge is gone, it is not easily rebuilt. The engineers retire, the institutional memory disperses, the manufacturing processes are discontinued. What remains is a name and a logo, available for licensing to whoever wants to put it on whatever they are selling this season. That is not nothing, but it is very far from what it was. 2346 picture a kitchen in Pennsylvania in the winter of 1962. The linoleum is cold underfoot before the heat comes up. A woman in a house coat opens the refrigerator door. The handle is chrome and cool to the touch. The seal gives with a soft resistance, and the light inside comes on immediately, the way it always does. The way it has done every morning for the 6 years since the refrigerator was delivered and plugged in, and has not required a single visit from a repairman since. The cold air moves out into the kitchen. The smell of last night's dinner is in there, and the butter dish and the bottle of milk standing straight and white on the top shelf. She takes what she needs and closes the door. The W on the front catches the morning light for a moment, and then it is just a refrigerator again, doing its work, making no demands, asking for nothing except to be left alone to do what it was built to do. In the living room, the television is on. It is a Westinghouse. The picture's good. The cabinet is wood veneer, and it sits on four legs in the corner where it has sat since they bought it, and the children will watch cartoons on it on Saturday morning, and the husband will watch the news on it at 6, and the family will gather around it on Sunday evenings, the way their parents gathered around the radio. Down in the basement, the washing machine is cycling through its program, moving the week's laundry through its drum, with a rhythm that has become part of the house's ambient sound, as unremarkable and reliable as the furnace or the clock on the mantel. Above the kitchen sink, the light fixture holds two Westinghouse bulbs that have been burning since October and will burn until spring without being thought about once. This is not a remarkable household. It is an ordinary American household in an ordinary American winter. And the ordinariness is the point. Westinghouse was not a luxury brand. It was not an aspirational brand in the way that term is used today, meaning a brand you buy to signal something about yourself to other people. It was something rarer and in many ways more valuable. It was a brand you trusted completely and therefore stopped thinking about, which is the highest form of confidence a consumer can extend to a manufacturer. The refrigerator is just the refrigerator. The W is just the W. And that invisibility, that absorption into the texture of daily life, was the achievement of 100 years of engineering done right. Westinghouse entered the American home as a promise. The promise was not made in advertising language, though the advertising language captured it well enough. You can be sure. That was all. Not exciting, not glamorous, just certain. The certainty that the thing would work tomorrow the way it worked today, and the day after that, and 10 years from now, when the children had grown, and the kitchen had been repainted, and the neighborhood had changed, but the refrigerator was still running, still holding the cold, still lighting up when you opened the door in the morning. That promise carried something beyond commerce. In the post-war decades, when millions of American families were building lives on the foundation of steady work and modest prosperity, the reliability of the objects in their homes was not a trivial matter. It was a form of stability. A washing machine that worked meant Monday was manageable. A refrigerator that kept food cold meant the grocery budget was not wasted. A television that held its picture meant the family had a place to gather in the evenings. These were not luxuries. They were the physical infrastructure of a way of life, and Westinghouse had spent decades earning the right to be trusted with that infrastructure. The brand carried with it something of the larger American conviction of that era. The conviction that things built here, by people who knew their work, in factories where quality was a matter of professional pride, would last. That conviction was not naive. It was based on evidence. The refrigerators did last. The washing machines did run for 20 years. The turbines did power the cities. The reactors did generate the electricity. The evidence was in the objects themselves, present in American homes and factories and power plants across the country, doing the work they had been designed to do with a consistency that justified the trust that had been placed in them. What Westinghouse built was not just a product line. It was a relationship between a manufacturer and the people who depended on what it made. A relationship grounded in the understanding that reliability is not a feature, it is a covenant. When you put the W on the door, you are telling the person who opens that door every morning that you have thought about what they need, that you have built it carefully, and that you stand behind it. That covenant, maintained across generations, is what transformed a brand into an institution. George Westinghouse lost control of his company in 1907. Forced out by the board of the institution he had created 7 years before he died. He did not live to see the frost-free refrigerator, or the color television, or the World's Fair Pavilion, or the USS Nautilus, or the 147,000 employees, or any of the evidence that what he started in Pittsburgh in 1886 had become one of the most consequential industrial enterprises in American history. He lived to see the War of Currents won, and the lights come on at Niagara Falls and the grid begin to spread across the country. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the man who had spent his life solving the problem of how to get electricity to the places that needed it understood, at the end, that the work had been done, that the infrastructure was in place, that the current would keep flowing long after he was gone. The current does keep flowing. The alternating current that George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla proved at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 still runs through every outlet in every American home. It powers the refrigerators, some of them carrying the W, most of them carrying other names, and the washing machines and the televisions and the light bulbs and every other device that the post-war American household accumulated over the decades. The grid that Westinghouse built the foundation of is still there, expanded and updated and managed by other hands, but built on the principles he fought for and proved. That is not a small inheritance to leave to a country. The company is gone. The name survives in a diluted form on products made elsewhere by people with no connection to Pittsburgh or to the engineering culture that the name once guaranteed. The factories are largely silent. The communities that were built around them are smaller and quieter than they were. What was lost when Westinghouse lost itself was not just a brand or a business. It was a particular kind of institutional integrity. The integrity of an organization that knew what it was for, that had built its identity around the quality of what it made, and that maintained that identity across a century of American life. Somewhere tonight there is a woman in her 70s who still remembers the refrigerator her mother had. She does not think about it often, but if you ask her, she will tell you that it ran for 23 years without a problem, that it was white with a chrome handle, that the W was on the door, and that when it finally stopped working, her mother cried a little. Not for the refrigerator exactly, but for everything that refrigerator had witnessed. All the mornings it had held the cold, while the family around it grew and changed, and eventually scattered. Some things are just appliances, and some things are the shape of a life.